Well, that didn't age well, to say the least. So the federal criminal trial of Sean Diddy Combs continues today as he faces 5 total counts of related charges, including 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking, and 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. And he's pleading not guilty to all of the charges. In addition to this criminal case, Combs is also subject to dozens of other civil lawsuits from alleged victims. Some of the other things he's been accused of are pretty egregious, and the raids back on his home in April of 2024 aren't doing much for his image during this case. Some of the evidence being shown in the case itself is also pretty damning, like this security camera footage that shows him seemingly beating and dragging his former girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, in a Los Angeles hotel hallway back on March 5th, 2016. Now, his lawyers petitioned for this video to not be shown in court, but the judge ruled against that. And according to reports of the first full day in court, which was on Monday, 2 witnesses testified against Combs. And Combs was accompanied by his mother and children, and at times when the testimonies became especially graphic, 3 of his daughters were seen leaving the room, unsurprisingly. Now, Combs' defense has painted himself as a complicated man and attempted to excuse his actions by saying that domestic violence isn't sex trafficking. His defense also says that this case has far more to do with his private life than anything else, and that the court has turned it into something it isn't. Regardless, though, of what they say, Combs faces at least 15 years in prison if convicted, so it looks like swagger can only get you so far. Here with reaction is Davis Younts, a military defense attorney with Younts Law. Davis, thank you for joining me.
Always an honor, Riley.
So there was a lot to start with here. I want to ask you first about that video that was shown in court, even though Combs' team asked for it not to be. What do you make of that?
So that evidence is not the typical type of evidence that you would see in a case like this, because there are no charges that are directly related to it. So there are no assault charges or domestic violence charges specifically related to that. However, the issue is the larger picture of this sort of organization that he was running. And really, this is going to be a question of consent. This case is going to come down to the issue of whether or not the individuals that engaged in activity, sexual activity and other things during these so-called freak-offs did so consensually, and if the relationships were consensual. So the prosecution is going to try to show a pattern of violence. That's where the racketeering conspiracy charges come in. And videos like this will show that the individuals involved didn't have a choice. They felt forced to participate under threat of violence or concern that they would be assaulted if they didn't do what he said. So that's the challenge for the government, is to prove that there was a pattern of force and violence. So regardless of what's seen in videos where aspects of it may look consensual, there was an overall threat of force that coerced people into engaging in activities.
Yes, and of course at those freak-offs, as you just mentioned, so it's pretty disturbing to read about what's been alleged regarding those parties, people being drugged, hypothetically, allegedly, forced to participate in very disturbing behavior with each other. Even if they weren't, he was supposedly overseeing it, and there's a whole lot more where that comes from. So then I want to ask you about this other point that I find very interesting. I haven't seen anything like this before, so please excuse my ignorance on this, Davis, but to hear his team argue that so much of what's been alleged or what happened in his private life, and therefore it's not really anything to do with what's going on. They say you're just making something up into something it's not. I find that very strange, and I want to get your thoughts about that legal take from his defense team.
Yeah, listen, his defense team has a real challenge to present a case to this jury that proves everything was consensual and that nothing that he's charged with has risen to the level of a crime. So even in their opening statement, they had to concede, listen, you're going to see a video of a physical assault. You're going to see video of a violent assault, but he's not charged with assault. He's not charged with domestic violence in these federal charges. Very specifically, he's charged with things that don't involve assault, physical assault in that way. And so that's the real challenge for his defense team. So the defense team has to come up with a strategy that says, listen, he's a bad boy. He may have done things that he's not proud of. He may have done things that you don't like, but those don't meet, and that's not the same thing as federal criminal charges that we see here. The other thing they're going to have to do, and they haven't really gotten into the heart of cross-examination yet, but the other thing you're going to see is they're going to try to show that these victims that were involved in this case benefited financially from accusing him of doing these things without consent, that they benefited financially, that there were civil settlements and other things, and that they have a motivation to lie. So that's what you're going to see from the defense team. And again, as I said before, the government's going to have to focus on the physical force that was used, this pattern of violence and arson that he's been engaged in, as well as demonstrating that you can't consent to these activities when you have been drugged, right? Obviously, you can't consent if you're out of your mind. So it's going to be a very interesting situation that's going to come out. And unfortunately, I mean, all of this is wildly inappropriate things that we would never want to have to talk about in detail on the news, let alone discuss with anyone else. But it's extremely, extremely troubling that behavior he was engaged in, regardless of the legality of it. That's the legal tactics side of this, right? How was it charged? How do you prove that? What are the defenses? But overall, it does paint a very, very disturbing pattern of a depraved, violent individual who used his position, his power, his money to control an empire. And that's really what this case is about.
Completely. By the way, it's a pretty bold thing for people to assume or to allege that the victims that are coming forward have some incentive to lie, and so they are. Maybe there's an incentive there, maybe not, but the only thing that matters is what is true and does it meet that bar of criminality. So I want to ask you, Davis, just from what you've seen so far, we're early on into this trial. I'm not sure how long it could go on for, but what do you make of his defense team's strategy thus far? Do you think it's been a wise one, or do you think it could backfire on them?
You know, I think it is a challenge for any defense attorneys to come up with a defense for this. And this is going to be an emotionally laden case with emotional testimony. I do think that their concept of what is actually consensual, what's not, and were these essentially arguing, I think in some respects, these were mutually beneficial relationships, and people made decisions to please him in order to have access to his influence, to his money, to his empire. And I think that's really the challenge, but that's often the challenge in these cases. So there's going to be, I think, a lot of thought about, his overall history of violence as well as the power dynamic that's present here. But again, these are very, very experienced defense attorneys. They're some of the best if you look at their record and their history. So they're going to come up with the best defense they can. It's going to be very interesting to see how the testimony unfolds, as well as the credibility of some of these witnesses that are called. And I think interesting as well is just the way this is charged under racketeering conspiracy. Charging it that way does allow the prosecutors to get into kind of his history and the pattern of this empire that he created. And I do think that makes it extremely challenging for the defense.
I would agree with you there. I'm not sure what's going to happen in the coming days, but this is a huge case, and we will certainly be following. And I'd love to have you back on soon, actually, Davis, to talk about more updates as soon as we get more information.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Davis. I appreciate your time.
All right, take care.
Left to men like Davis, Younts fight for these Navy SEALs.
Davis Younts, you are an attorney who has successfully defended naval